Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this month's Lunch and Learn research seminar on the findings and recommendations from the Family Group Conferencing Evaluation. My name's Merran Butler and I'm the Director of Research in the Family and Community Services Insights Analysis and Research area, also known as FACSIAR at the Department of Communities and Justice. To start today, I'd like to pass over to Irene Wardle, who will do the acknowledgement of country. Thanks, Irene.
Thanks. Warami Nalawa Medigar. Hello, come in, sit down, friends. My name is Irene Wardle, and my mother was born under a great gum tree on the lands of the Biripi Nation on the far north coast of New South Wales. My great-grandmother was removed and placed in the Sydney Basin around Parramatta, and we acknowledge her ancestry as Dharug. Welcoming everyone today will focus on the importance of family, and especially to those who work with Aboriginal families. And as an Aboriginal mother, grandmother and aunt to many, I wish to speak about the story of the bush native bee as my acknowledgement to country and their significance to kinship systems. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and surrounding clan groups and the traditional owners of the land and waters that each and everyone lives, works and studies from across Australia and the First Nations of the world. I pay my respects to my elders past and present and future, knowledge keepers who continue the traditions and culture for the future generations. Bees are the key to both our future and the past. The Australian native bee can pollinate both the native plants of Australia and those that have been imported here. Why do I mention the bee in my acknowledgement of country? I've been taught by my mother, who was a beekeeper in her childhood and teenage years. She held the responsibility as an older sibling to maintain the hive, care for the bees throughout the Great Depression and during World War II, and as her father during the 1890s till his death. The bee is very much the foundation of the kinship structure. It is made up of many and led by only a few wise ones. The native bee doesn't sting, it can survive without violence, and the foundation of kinship is based on love and support. The Granny's law guides the family structure, maintains cultural links and traditions that are practiced for thousands of years. Survival is only possible if the family unit is maintained and connected to our identity and belonging that can be filled within the hearts of our babies. The bee represents the loving work of my elders who continue the work of the beekeeping families, creating pathways that promote health and nurture resilience. Aboriginal families work in the same capacity. Our hives are perceived as different to that of others, and their family structure is made up of many members, and not one person can hold all the power. Although Granny's law does play an important role in the delivery of order amongst the extended family, her word is never questioned because it comes from a lifelong time of accrued knowledge as wisdom, just like the queen bee. The bee represents the family, the ability to adjust under harsh conditions. Their home is perceived as fragile, not as strong as imported bees. However, has survived in the harsh Australian climate for many thousands of years, but still maintains a home, not as grand as its foreign cousins, but is full of unconditional love, traditions and customs that keep the family strong to support the children. The bee survives through extended kinship networks, creating hives and nominating the strongest female to rule. The men of the colony have their roles and represent the position they hold. The family is only as strong as its weakest member, and they work together to maintain the traditions and cultures of certainty that hold them together, just like the native bee. The kinship networks continue to provide the foundation to nurture strong, resilient children. As professionals in your chosen fields, remember you too have a role to support the fragility in the bee colony. Encourage the kinship systems to celebrate their uniqueness and cultural traditions that have survived for thousands of years. Welcome you all here today.
Thank you, Irene. I too would like to acknowledge that wherever we're joining today's webinar from across New South Wales, we're all living and working on Aboriginal land. I would like to acknowledge the Barramadigal people of the Dharug Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the area where I have the privilege of joining from today. I would also like to warmly welcome all the webinar participants that we have with us today. We have more than 600 people registered, which shows the importance of this topic. At today's Lunch and Learn webinar, researchers from the Research Centre for Children and Families at the University of Sydney will share findings from the Family Group Conferencing Evaluation, and Stephen Bray, Acting Director from the Family Preservation and Child Protection Team at DCJ, will update you on how these findings and recommendations are being actioned in policy and practice. Following the presentations, we may have some time for some questions and answers. So if you have any questions that you think about during the presentation, please put them in the chat section. Now I'd like to introduce you to our presenters for this afternoon. Amy Conley-Wright is Professor of Child and Family Social Work at the University of Sydney and Director of the Research Centre for Children and Families. She conducts applied research to build evidence about supporting families and promoting child well-being, focused on active exchange of research findings into policy and practice. Irene is a lecturer in Aboriginal Education and Indigenous Studies and was the Aboriginal Research Partnerships Manager for the Research Centre for Children and Families. Before entering academia, Irene held numerous positions in community as an Aboriginal intensive support child and family worker and a manager in employment pathways for vulnerable and disadvantaged young Aboriginal people. She is a proud Darug woman from the Blue Mountains who also has kinship connections to the Biripi Nation. Stephanie Schurer is a Professor of Economics in the School of Economics at the University of Sydney. She is an internationally recognised expert in the field of the economics of human development. In 2021, Stephanie was awarded the Economic Society of Australia's Young Economist of the Year Award and the Vice-Chancellor's Award for Outstanding Teaching and Research. Dr. Betty Liu is a research fellow at the Research Centre for Children and Families, where she actively contributes to advancing Australian research in child welfare and out-of-home care. With a background in developmental psychology and mixed methods approaches and a strong interest in understanding how the early environment can best support children's development, her research program includes the analysis of child welfare data to provide insights and drive change in practice and policy. Stephen Bray is the Acting Director of Family Preservation and Child Protection within the Strategy, Policy and Commissioning Division of the Department of Communities and Justice. Stephen has over 10 years' experience in government policy and law reform in areas such as child protection, privacy, discrimination, courts procedures, and civil liabilities. Thank you to our presenters, and I'll now hand over to Amy.
Thank you, Merran, very much for that introduction. And thank you for the beautiful acknowledgement of country for Irene. And thank you to everyone who's joining the webinar today. I too would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging on the various lands from which we're meeting today, and to extend that respect to any Aboriginal colleagues who are with us. So I'll begin by giving an overview of the evaluation and the colleagues who will present the findings. So the evaluation of family group conferencing focused on family group conferencing offered by the Department of Communities and Justice and had three components. So the implementation element focused on how the program is rolled out and the experiences of families, DCJ staff, and facilitators and their views and perspectives on the program. And that will be, the findings will be presented by Irene Wardle. The outcomes component of the evaluation examined associations between participation in a family group conference and later child protection involvement for children and young people who received an FGC compared to a non-treatment group. And those findings will be presented by Professor Stephanie Schurer. And then the economic analysis examined the costs of the FGC compared to the benefits, and that will be presented by Dr. Betty Liu. Before we begin, we would like to also thank the Evaluation Steering Committee for the family group conferencing process, which was composed of several teams within DCJ. And we also would like to acknowledge the work of our colleagues who are other members of the research team, which included Associate Professor Lynette Riley, Dr. Susan Collings, Dr. Sarah Chifchi, and Suzanne Pope. And to note that we received ethics approval from IATSIS as well as the University of Sydney. So just to start by sharing the evaluation, the implementation evaluation and the design, and then handing over to Irene. We gathered various forms of data across the evaluation. And for the implementation, to assess the implementation, we gathered information from families. So we had 40 family members participate in interviews, and the majority of those were Aboriginal family members. We collected data through surveys of the workforce, and that included surveys with caseworkers, caseworker managers, and independent facilitators with a very high level of participation, particularly from facilitators. We did focus groups with facilitators, district coordinators who allocate the FGC, and also caseworkers and caseworker managers, again with a very high representation of Aboriginal colleagues participating. We observed a set of family group conferences just to get a sense, a feel for how those worked, and also then conducted interviews after the FGC with the facilitator to understand the process. And we also collected data from referral information forms, which were matched to family plans to understand the reasons why families were referred to an FGC, and then the types of family plans that were developed to address those issues. And now I'll hand over to Irene to share highlights of our findings in terms of the implementation of FGC.
Thanks, Amy. We looked at the factors associated with a positive FGC experience. I think for those in the audience would be well aware of what's not working. In the preparation stage, what came out from the families was, and obviously facilitators and caseworkers, clear communication around issues and expectations especially make, we have a responsibility to make that very clear to our families. Early engagement of family, kin and community. That was one of the essential components of a successful FGC, and having a skilled facilitator who briefs the family. During the FGC, the facilitator being skilled in handling family dynamics and offering cultural support. Clarity around non-negotiables and support in private family time if needed. That was a very big factor. And DCJ caseworkers or managers in attendance, not last-minute cancellations. We all get busy, but that was one of the family communications that came through. That was quite a common occurrence. Family plan implementation, active caseworker support for the implementation, accountability for what was agreed, and DCJ conducts the 3-month review. For many, that was non-existent. Next one. Sorry, we're learning. The FGC process can draw out the strengths of Aboriginal kinship networks and communities. This is dependent on early engagement of kin and other important people in the child's life, so that the right people to offer support to the child are present for the FGC. And that takes time, I realise, but that's an essential ingredient. Promoting cultural safety through the support from Aboriginal facilitators and cultural support people is critical. Families were very positive about having Aboriginal facilitators who demonstrated cultural safety and respect. The role of the DCJ cultural support worker is not clear and transparent to families. And since this person is a DCJ employee, they are not perceived as neutral. Support from NGOs is underutilised. Can't stress that enough. And the third one was there appears to be limited integration of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principle in the FGC implementation. Attention to the principal elements of participation, partnership, placement and connection, particularly reaching out to the kinship network and focusing on cultural connections, preparation, meetings and follow-up phases would enhance the model's potential for self-determination. One of those elements that are missing disrupts the whole outcome of the FGC. It is essential to have the right people in the room, which requires identifying family members and other important people in the child's life. I talked about the acknowledgement and the extended kinship system, referring to a beehive. That's exactly what you need to do. You need to look beyond word of mouth and utilise time effectively in getting the right people in the room for a right outcome. Currently, despite the program guidance, there's a lack of clarity about who will spend time finding family members, caseworkers or facilitators. This needs to be really drawn out. Family dynamics impact upon the ability of the family to come together and make decisions in the FGC process. Skilled facilitators, and in particular Aboriginal facilitators came out stronger, have a key role in managing these dynamics to avoid conflicts, escalating and keeping the focus on the child and the family plan. Conflict management skills and competency vary between facilitators. Caseworkers need to provide facilitators with adequate information about the purpose of the FGC at the referral stage, so that facilitators can work with families to prepare for the conference and the families can effectively participate in decision making. And this is more so with expectations. Some expectations they didn't know. They thought that DCJ had made up their mind. They thought that the facilitator had already demonstrated the plan. It doesn't matter what the outcomes are, the expectation has to be clear. That was one of the gripes. They just did not know what their role was for attending the FGC in the first place. So that, I can't stress that enough, and particularly from the Aboriginal families. Part of the preparation phase is a frank assessment of whether children should directly participate. This will depend on the specific circumstances, including the likelihood of family conflict and the child's development capabilities. That was more so when it became a family reunion rather than the focus of the FGC. Where families don't understand the scope of decision making, they may feel set up to fail. While family decision making can contribute during a child protection assessment of child safety and risk, if the child is already in out-of-home care, the scope of decision making is less clear. So that particular point needs to be looked at quite strongly. Honesty and transparency are necessary in the I can never say this word, reciprocal communication between families and DCJ as part of the FGC process. Where families felt that DCJ was honest and transparent, they had a better feeling about the FGC. Regardless of the outcome, the honesty and transparency was more important. Clear and comprehensive communication between DCJ and the facilitators prior to an FGC can also help ensure that the family receive the right information in the preparation phase. When families do not receive the right information or expectations of family members are not shared, it hinders relationships and communication between DCJ and families. It even causes further rift between families. It is important for the caseworker and manager caseworker assigned to the child's case to be present for the FGC. Where alternative DCJ representatives attended, their lack of familiarity with the case often undermined the ability to approve the family plan and to identify specific casework support to implement the family plan. So once again, this was really important. It actually devalues the work of the caseworker who was assigned to the family. For whatever reason they can't attend, it undermines all their hard work. So it actually goes against, for future work with the families. For the FGC to be successful, families need support from caseworkers to implement the family plan, yet families are often left on their own. Particularly the feedback from Aboriginal families that I got. It was like they were set up to fail. That's how they felt. There was strong support across family and workforce participants for caseworkers to actively and frequently follow up with families, to check on the implementation of the family plan and make referrals where needed. And that's where the not utilising the NGOs effectively. While there is a clear guidance in DCJ policy that caseworkers are expected to convene a review after 3 months, family and workforce participants indicated that this aspect of the model is not being implemented consistently. There is confusion as to whose responsibility it is to arrange and conduct the follow-up review. And finally, and I pass that on now to you.
Stephanie.
Oh,
and you've got to head off to teaching.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm about to go into teaching now. So any questions that you can direct to Betty and Amy. I'm sure they'll fill it in. My key point for everyone is that time and building relationships takes time. So that's my key point I'd like to for you to take away from today. So appreciate the opportunity to share the results. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Irene, for a beautiful acknowledgement of country this morning and to guide us through the first part of the evaluation. I would like to quickly acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm meeting you today from. I'm in Gadigal, usually I'm sitting in Gadigal country, but today I sit in Ku-ring-gai country, up north of the bridge. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and respect express my respect for their elders, past, present, and future. So I'm going to talk with you a little bit about the outcomes evaluation. In the interest of time, I can only give you the highlights and cannot go too deep into the methods that we have used. And everything I'm going to say today is really about short-term impacts of the family group conference. We cannot yet say anything about the longer-term impacts. So the family group conference, unfortunately, was not implemented within a randomized controlled trial, which is usually used where you have some people randomized into getting the treatment and others get randomized not yet getting the treatment, or perhaps not getting the treatment at all. And in these settings, if you want to make a causal evaluation, a causal statement of saying, does the program work or does it not work, you would have really needed that trial. But since we didn't have this, we studied very carefully how the family group conference was rolled out and realized there is some form of natural experiment that we can use, and therefore can methods from the policy evaluation literature to still use a statistical model and an analysis so that we can be a little bit more sure that this is, at least for some outcomes, that this is causal and not just statistical association. So we are using a generalized difference in difference model, which takes advantage of different implementation dates for the families who received it. Overall, 2,929 families did receive a referral. Within these families were 5,803 children who received a referral. And the guideline was that within 4 weeks, a family group conference should have been convened. This happened within 4 weeks, unfortunately, only in just over 1 in 6 families. And 1 in 4 families never received, in fact, the family group conference, even though it was referred. But we're taking advantage of this fact that families receive this at different points in time. And I show you a graph in a second how the statistical model works. But in its most simple description, it basically, the treatment group is all these families who got the referral, but have received the family group conference, compared to everyone who also received the referral, but hasn't received it yet at this point in time, but will receive it in the future. This is a difference in difference model. It's widely used in all sorts of policy evaluations worldwide when there is not a randomized controlled trial. And as long as you can control somehow for these longer term trends before the treatment in child protection contact, and for individual fixed effects, and in our case, we also controlled for these facilitator fixed effects. There were in total 118 facilitators who conducted these FGCs. Then, under certain assumptions, you can talk about a causal impact. And that is the case if those who received the family group conference and those who didn't receive the family group conference were kind of on the same longer term trend in child protection contact. And we had to assume that there was no systematic logic in the rollout timing of the family group conference. And I show you this in a graph how this works, because this is important to put the results into a specific light. So what this idea is, I mean, there were many different rollout dates. Some families received it on the same date, others, there were hundreds of rollout dates, but in like in most simplistic terms, so the referrals all happened between June 2017 and July 2021. And so the first family, there was only 23 families who received in 2017. So in 2017, you have these first 23 families who received the family group conference. So you can compare the outcomes at this point in time with all of these other families in bucket number 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 in the same year who haven't received it yet, but will in the future. Or you can also compare them with their own outcomes into the future. Before. Okay. So in the second year, then the second bucket, there's families who receive it in 2018. So the treatment group is everyone who received it in 2017 and 2018, and you compare it to themselves before and to everyone else who will receive it but hasn't received it yet. So this is what we say, it's the methods that we use to identify this causal impact so that we can do a cost-benefit evaluation. So how did we evaluate the outcomes for the family group conference? We used de-identified DCJ data, administrative data, from 2015 to 2021. We had the whole data, child protection and out-of-home care data available up from 1999, but at some point we said we have so much data available, let's just start from 2015. Overall, we had 60,487 Aboriginal person year observations or person date observations and 48,387 non-Aboriginal person date observations. And that's important because overall there were just 5,803 children who were referred to an FGC, but we observed these kids over many different time periods. And so that's how we get a very large sample, and we just follow them through the timelines. We can follow up somewhere, so from 6 months onwards, but we cannot really follow up for much longer. For some sample members, we can follow up for 2 years, those who received it early. But for those who received it, in 2021, we really can't follow them up for very long. The outcomes I'm going to talk today about is a safety and risk assessment after a helpline call, the risk of serious harm classification. That's a label to say that this kid really needs attention at the moment. A substantiation of some form of maltreatment. As you know, this could be physical, verbal, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse or neglect. And an out-of-home care placement. And so of course, the out-of-home care placement is what we perhaps want to avoid the most because it's the most costly intervention and the most invasive for the family. And that's why I've put it here at the bottom of the pyramid because it carries most weight. Unfortunately, and I will say more to this, for the out-of-home care placement, we couldn't use the same methodology. I will say in a second a little bit more about this. So everything I'm going to say about SARA, Roche, and substantiation outcomes has a little bit more strength in the method of talking about causal impacts out of home care placement. We couldn't really use the same method because much fewer observations. And so we talk about associations. So the estimation results, and we can talk more about details if you like. So we find statistically significant reductions in helpline reports for emotional abuse and neglect, for safety and risk assessments, for risk of serious harm classifications, and certain harm substantiations like neglect. And I'm going to show you now a graph to show you something about the magnitude of these results, but also about the heterogeneity of these findings between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal children. So what you see here in this graph, and please do not go away, I'm going to explain everything that you see, are the treatment effects estimated in magnitude, and we express this in percent relative to the sample mean before the treatment. So we say what was the average neglect before the treatment, what was the average SARA, what was the average Roche, what was the average substantiation before treatment. So we take this percentage point reduction in these things relative to the sample mean. So we have percent reductions, and that helps us to say something more about how many kids have had a better outcome. So neglect, the orange bar, by the way, tells you something about the pooled sample. The light gray one is for Aboriginal children and dark gray is for non-Aboriginal children. On the vertical axis, you see these percent reductions. A negative here just means a reduction. And so neglect, for instance, what you see, it is significant for all groups, but for Aboriginal children, it's slightly the largest magnitude, so a 20% reduction. And this means that 1 in 5 Aboriginal children avoided a helpline response because of neglect. SARA, the reductions are larger for non-Aboriginal children, but they're significant for both groups. And for non-Aboriginal children, for Aboriginal children, it's a reduction of 25%. So 1 in 4 Aboriginal children avoided a SARA because of the intervention, and 40%, so 2 in 5 non-Aboriginal children avoided that. Roche is a very small treatment effect. It was significant for Aboriginal children here, this light gray bar. But only 1 in 20 of these Aboriginal children avoided significantly a Roche classification. The music plays, so the factor really comes with substantiation, really the hard talk of investigation. So now a kid was substantiated. So we find a very strong treatment effect, a reduction. So for Aboriginal children, a reduction of 50%, so 1 in 2 Aboriginal children avoid a substantiation because of the family group conference. And for non-Aboriginal children, it's even larger, so it's 2 in 3 kids. So this is a large effect. For the removal from home, we couldn't really do the same analysis because there are much fewer removals, and so the method didn't really work out. So what we did was we compared those referred to the FGC, but didn't get the FGC with those who were referred and did get the FGC, and then controlled for lots of different observable characteristics. So we controlled for longer term trends in the ways that we plugged in the number of contacts with child protection before, but we're not certain that this method of comparing these 3,728 kids who were referred and got the FGC with those 1,251 who were referred but never got it. We compare them and control for observable characteristics. So these estimates are really associations and not causal. So I show you these results. They are promising in one respect and perhaps not so promising in other respects. So remember, this is again relative, the treatment effect relative to the pre-treatment baseline, so the averages, so everything is in percent. And we don't find really anything for Aboriginal children. There's a small negative treatment effect of minus 2.5%, so 1 in 40 Aboriginal children would avert a removal if they had the FGC, but the effect is not statistically significant. But we do see this for non-Aboriginal children. This is this dark gray result. We see a reduction of 15% in that risk relative to the pretreatment mean, and that means roughly 1 in 6 non-Aboriginal children averted an out-of-home care entry because of the FGC, but it is really more like an association. It's associated with this reduction, conditional on all these observables. This is the end of my part of the talk. I would like now to hand over to Betty Liu, who will take these numbers and put them into perspective within the economic evaluation that we have done to put some numbers on these findings, dollar numbers. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steffi. So I will be covering the economic evaluation. So really the aim of the economic evaluation was to address the question of whether the FGC program represents good value for money compared to alternative approaches to child protection. So really taking the numbers generated from Steffi's analysis and talking about, what are the benefits and what is that relative to the cost of actually running the program itself. So to answer this question, a cost-benefit analysis was applied using loosely the guidelines provided by New South Wales Treasury to estimate potential costs around economic, social, and environmental costs with the benefits of the program in monetary terms. So we followed these approximately, given that it's not all the data was available for those costs to do like a full monetary and non-monetary evaluation, but based on the information that we had and with Stephanie's excellent help, we were able to generate quite a few numbers, which I'll be presenting in a moment. So really the benefit cost ratio indicates whether an initiative like FGC increases or decreases overall social welfare. So it shows how many dollars society recoups for $1 invested in the FGC program, and this is reflected in the BCR, the benefit cost ratio. So it compares the present value of total social benefits, including avoided costs to the government and broader economic benefits to the client, which is expressed in dollars, and compared to the present value of all the costs associated with FGC. So to carry out this economic analysis, we first calculated the unit cost of operating the program, which was largely by role, and then Stephanie took on the role of determining the program's social benefits. So the FGC costs were based on figuring out the unit costs of the program, and these were used. These estimates were based on the transaction records within DCJ's record management system. And, you know, obviously the data was a little bit messy. I want to shout out to Nancy Richards for pulling together that wealth of data from the transaction records and I guess our attempts to attribute which of those costs were associated with FGC, because it wasn't completely clean, but I think we did the best that we could on the information. So FGC on average costs about $3,231 per family, which this excludes the casework costs. The costs do vary widely, but most of the costs is for the facilitator. But there are some variations depending on the complexity of the case, whether travel is involved, whether interpreters are needed, and how many children and family members are involved. So that may add some extra costs to the cost of the FGC. And it also depended on things like region as well. There were differences there, and an involvement of Aboriginal or culturally and linguistically diverse children tended to increase the average costs, which gave an additional, say, average $650 to $780 per case, likely due to the use of, additional use of interpreters, more family members being present, or more children being subject to the FGC, which might require a bigger venue or more sessions or more facilitators there. So I suppose the finding which is of the most interest here is around the cost of the FGC and what that means for the social benefits. So overall, the average cost of FGC is estimated to be about $7,900, and that includes the cost of DCJ staff time as well. Using the monetary value from existing economic analysis that were provided by DCJ, the total social benefits for things that Steffi covered around Roche substantiation, the benefits were estimated to be $91,032. And this is a sum of avoided costs to the government. So that's values around the likelihood of receiving a SARA, a safety and risk assessment, being re-reported at Roche or entering out-of-home care. And totaled with the broader economic benefits. So that's benefits to the client around improving quality adjusted life years through the reduction of things like the risk of post-traumatic stress disorder. So the main conclusion drawn here is that the FGC program increases social welfare. The benefit cost ratio, the BCR, exceeds 1. It indicates that the FGC is expected to generate incremental social value, and this is the case for both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal families. So for instance, you can see there the conclusion really is for every dollar spent on the FGC program, society recoups on average $7.20, $5.50 for families with Aboriginal children, and $8 for families with non-Aboriginal children. So that's really the economic analysis. So I will now move over to Amy, who will give us the recommendations. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you, Betty. Just in the interest of time, because I want to make sure that Stephen has time to speak to how the recommendations are being addressed. You can look at these slides later if you like, but just very briefly, 25 recommendations were made on the basis of the report, and they came in these 4 categories. The first was around Aboriginal communities, children and families, and Irene already really largely spoke to these, but these recommendations were about the importance of finding members of the Aboriginal kinship network, the right people, and making sure that they were equipped with the right information to have a role with the child, and also the recommendation to integrate the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principles, particularly focusing on participation so that families are able to fully participate in the process, and also making cultural connection a non-negotiable. We had recommendations around FGC preparation and engagement, and these largely were focusing on making sure caseworkers had time for family finding, that they were then that the referral forms equipped families to play a role and understand the scope of decision making, and then that caution that Irene mentioned earlier around including children and thinking about alternative ways if there's a high level of family conflict. Communications between DCJ and families, just that, again, if these FGCs are dependent on families having the right information in terms of the role that they can have. And so making sure they have that information, making sure their caseworkers and caseworker managers are present, and that there's consistent follow-up so that they can implement the family plan, because really the FGC is only as good as that sort of support for implementation. And then we had some recommendations about FGC processes and procedures, and that included around the timeframes. That wasn't always met, but that was important to get family members there, to monitor family facilitator performance and give families different ways of providing feedback, and then using that for a professional development process, and then making sure that there's data kept on the review of the family plan. And then also just some other final ones around monitoring the program overall in terms of how data is recorded. So I'll hand over now to Stephen so he can share how the recommendations are being addressed. And if you want to connect with us, there's information. Please do reach us out to us and connect us on our website. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So I'm Stephen Bray. I'm the Director of Family Preservation and Child Protection in the Department of Communities and Justice. I'll also pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land of which we're meeting. For me here is the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation. We are running a bit short on time, so I'm going to be skipping over this very quickly. Some of these slides I won't touch on at all, but they are all going to be available as a resource on the webpage. So I think it might be a useful tool for you later on anyway. Family group conferencing, just for context, this was first piloted in DCJ back in 2011. Since being rolled out to be statewide. It was a recommendation from the Wood Inquiry. So we're really excited to have the opportunity to work with Sydney University to evaluate it and to see how we can make it better. I think some of the key findings have already been described by some of the other presenters, but I think in short, the finding is it works. That BCRs that as mentioned of benefit cost ratios of over seven, so recouping $7 for every dollar spent is really, really high. So we're really focused on getting the most out of family group conferencing and making sure that it's used and in a way that sort of capitalizes on those benefits, but also paying close attention to the things that aren't working as well, in particular how the effects for the Aboriginal community was slightly less. I'll run through, the four sort of categories of recommendations, they're all in the report. I suggest you read that. They're at the executive summary at the front. I suppose I'd probably categorize the recommendations made as a lot of, not a radical redesign of the whole model, the model was shown to be very effective, but more practice and implementation and procedure. And like so many things in child protection, it's all about how it's implemented and the practice around it. So we're really focused on those areas in particular. There are probably a couple of, I think, pretty sticky issues that we feel like we need to dig a bit more into in order to kind of get to the root of the problem, and I'll come to those shortly. So the first theme in the recommendations to do with family group conferencing preparation and family engagement. So really, this is ensuring that the right people are at the FGC, they're well informed and they're ready to participate. We've already started some work on sort of communications to kind of reinforce some of those aspects on that front. The second theme, arguably the most important, is its application to Aboriginal families as well. So one of the key recommendations there was making sure that Aboriginal facilitators are available for everyone who requests them. We've marked that as complete because that is our policy now, that if you request an Aboriginal facilitator, you get one. And we've upped our proportion of Aboriginal facilitators are now at 43% of our total amount of facilitators. So that's pretty high. We're quite happy with that, but there's always more work to be done, and we're going to be continuing to look at ways to sort of focus on that. Communication between DCJ and families, obviously super critical. This is before the FGC, making sure that the caseworker who is actually working with the family is the same one that's involved around the FGC as well, and the follow-up and communication is really critical there as well. We've listed all these as in progress because it's hard to know when you've actually completed these things because they are ongoing practice improvements, and we're really looking at ways to make sure that this practice sort of permeates. and improves. And then family group conferencing processes and procedures, I think as mentioned, we're looking at some of these recommendations are around reducing delays in FGCs. There's a target time frame of 4 weeks, then the average is I think a bit over 7 weeks. So we're looking at that. Improving the capability of FGC coordinators and facilitators, and also looking at ways to improve the use of data so we can evaluate this going forwards. I mentioned before, like a couple of the, that's a lot of recommendations in there. I suggest you take your own time to go through them, but probably for us, like the two big headline things that we're focusing on are the utilisation of family groups conferences and its effectiveness for Aboriginal families. So the utilisation, as mentioned, for there's a requirement within the Care Act for alternative dispute resolution to be offered to every family prior to seeking a care order. Family group conferencing is DCJ's preferred model of alternative dispute resolution, although there are others that can be offered depending on the circumstances, including sort of, Aboriginal care circles and things like that. But overall, like the proportion of kids that were for where care orders were made, the amount that actually participated in FGC was pretty low. It was about 24%. So that is, we are looking like the causes of that we're getting to the bottom of. Is it like our possible hypotheses are it's the tight timeline before a court, perhaps the caseworker is not aware or doesn't buy into the concept of an FGC, perhaps it's caseworker capacity as well, or what could be happening is that FGCs are being offered but refused and it's not being recorded correctly, and they could be refused because the family doesn't trust DCJ, or they could be, or they're just disengaged, or it could be like if they're an Aboriginal family, there's a whole legacy of history and distrust, completely understandably. In terms of the second key issue that we're focusing on in terms of how we make this more effective for Aboriginal families, we're looking at like how and when Aboriginal families are engaged in family group conferencing, the levels of support provided to them and how that should differ to take into account that cultural context, the pre-work that's required, the amount and the capability of our Aboriginal facilitators, and also, frankly, I think perhaps in some areas that there might be things that can be offered that are other than FGCs, depending on the cultural circumstances of the family and their preferences as well. So in terms of what DCJ is doing, I mean, this is basically our project scope and what we're working on now. So what's in scope is we're looking at mapping the different alternative dispute resolution types in casework to family group conferencing, identifying improvements and changing practice to deliver FGC better to Aboriginal kids and their families, updating the resource material, making sure that's fit for purpose, and seeking ways to improve the utilisation of FGC as a whole. In terms of how we go about that next phase, really, it's probably it is a consultation exercise we need to do. We've got all those findings and the evidence base from the evaluation, thanks to our colleagues at Sydney University. But we're going to be going out to districts, to practitioners both within DCJ and externally, communities as part of that cultural consultation, and facilitators and administrators to help kind of unpick these issues and figure out what the best tool is that we can use to address some of those sort of practice areas which are shown to be a little bit lacking in FGC as well. And this overall is sort of a radar showing our process overall. So following the release of the report, we've done the initial evaluation, we've completed some of the quick wins to the extent we can say they are fully ever completed. The red dot is where we're up to now, which is where we're scoping and we're considering how to engage with stakeholders next. And then we're going to be looking at ways to really implement the remainder of the recommendations. And finally, very importantly as well, making sure that we have the data and a process to kind of feedback and evaluate how we've gone in addressing those recommendations and what the effect of our practice changes have been. So that's the end of my section now. I'll hand over to Merran.
Thanks. So I'd like to thank Amy, Betty, Stephanie, Irene and Stephen for your wonderful presentations today. We do have about 5 or so minutes for some questions. So there have been a few questions asked in the chat, and thanks to the presenters for answering some of those. So there was one asked about yarning circles, which was answered that they haven't been used, but there was a follow-up to that was whether they're being considered for the future. So I suppose, Stephen, that might be one for you.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk to that issue. Yeah, look, yarning circles are something which we're currently considering I suppose within the broader sort of bag of tools that caseworkers have, there are some legal restrictions on what we can call alternative dispute resolution under the Care Act. So FGC is one of them, Aboriginal care circles or something we use, but under the legislation, you need to have like an independent facilitator, and sometimes things like yarning circles might not quite hit that, but that doesn't mean they can't be used. It just means that that's another thing that caseworkers can have in their toolkit that they can use instead of or in addition to what's formally called like an alternative dispute resolution process underneath under the Care Act. So I think these things have been raised about as ideas for how we can sort of, I guess, think a bit laterally in terms of making dispute resolution more catered within the cultural context. They've been raised at a ministerial forum earlier this year with the minister as well. So it is something we're considering, but it's likely to fall outside the formal scope of what we call family group conferencing.
Great, thanks. Someone also asked whether you could, for the evaluators, could you confirm if the risk of removal was still high for Aboriginal children even with an FGC intervention? And if so, can you talk about any of the reasons for that?
Stephanie, you want to take that one on?
So the risk of removal is something I feel a little bit uncomfortable talking in a lot of detail. And the reason is because it is not such a common event. And the analysis that we have done is really associations. So we didn't find anything for Aboriginal children, like in a statistically large association. So we did say that as we continue working on this, potentially for peer review, that we maybe drill this down further, but I do not dare to say anything definite about this because we have said this in many meetings before the report was written that our results on the out-of-home care is just really the weakest of all of the results. I have a lot of trust in what we have done with, the other outcomes using this statistical model that I have talked about, and we have much more certainty about that model. But out-of-home care, look, I think out-of-home care is a very complex situation, and families whose kids have been removed have a lot of complex problems. This is a personal view. This is not a vetted view. I think that one intervention, like one family group conference, may not be able to handle those complex problems that families have who have a child in and out of home care. Maybe, Amy, you would like to add to this, but this is just what I've said. Last sentence is a personal view. We have not written exactly this in the report.
Well, about the intensity of it, I think when families are in out-of-home care, then the issues become more complicated. And people have asked about having a family group conference at different points in time and when it can be most valuable. So, but once there's a child is in out-of-home care, often the decisions are different. They're about contact or other types of decisions. Yeah.
I could add something to this just to clarify this, because I've written this in the discussion. Someone asked a question about this. Who made it into the family group conference had very specific characteristics. We evaluated, like we assessed some of these. We wanted to figure out who's actually channeled into it. And it looks like that those families who never had contact with the out-of-home care system were less likely to be channeled into the family group conference. But those who had some contact with out-of-home care, they had much fewer placements. So it looks like that the family group conference, the referral came in for families with little contact, with some contact, but with much fewer contact points with the out-of-home care system. So maybe this was a decision, a clear part of the algorithm to refer these kids, that they are not the most complex families.
Thank you. So we've got about 5 minutes left. So I think if we could just go round to each of the presenters briefly, and just if you could just give your, one key takeaway that you would like the participants to walk away with today, what would that be? So Amy?
Sure. I think the support for the family plan, because we often heard that was lacking, and that ended up being very disappointing to families who came up with a plan on the day and then didn't have the support to implement it. So I think that support is so important, and proactive casework is really needed. Thank you.
Great. Stephanie?
Oh, I'll talk about from the perspective of a scientist, a social scientist. When these interventions, what we realized with this intervention, that it would have been so good if there had been a stronger element of randomization or a discussion before you implement it, before you roll it out, to speak to researchers first, whom you want to have this evaluated for, how to do it, so that it could potentially be rolled out in better ways, so we can evaluate it in better ways. It could be a randomized controlled trial, but there's many different options. And especially if you want to have the longer term impacts, we know nothing about the longer term effects of this. This is all short term. The effects may just dissipate. We don't know this yet. You need to have a little bit more time given, 3 to 5 years, until we can evaluate it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Betty?
Thanks so much. I think the potential, the social benefits revealed from the economic analysis are quite telling from this one particular intervention. And I just want to echo Irene's point, given she's not here, but I know for her specifically the relationships that are developed, relationships with families and between caseworkers, with caseworkers and with facilitators matters so much. So it's the whole, I guess, purpose of family group conferencing is about allowing and empowering families to make decisions because they would know best. So I guess it's about really making sure everyone's aware of what their roles are, making sure the family is informed, and just really making sure that space is for them to make that decision, and that those decisions are not already made in advance. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And Stephen, from your perspective.
Oh, thank you. Look, I mean, I think that the evaluation's been really great in pointing out some of the practice areas we can improve on. But I suppose, like, what I would like people to take away is that the key finding that the family group conferencing works. Like, it had really positive results. Obviously, areas we can improve on, particularly with the Aboriginal cohort. But the benefits in economic terms alone are huge. And really, like, there's such opportunity if we can expand the utilization of it to really capitalize on that. And what I would say is, like, this evaluation, it's not the end of the process, it's the beginning of the process. Like, this is what is going to give us the solid foundations to really improve this project for all the people that we have responsibility to look after.
Thanks. So thanks once again to our presenters. It's a really interesting presentation today. And thank you to everybody who joined us. So everybody who was registered for the event will receive with a link to the recording, and some other links have already been posted into the chat. If you have any more questions that we didn't get time to get to, feel free to email the research team in FACSIAR. And finally, we'd like to invite you all to our final Lunch and Learn for 2023, which will be held on the 28th of November, same time. And the title of that webinar is Links and Our Space, Findings and Recommendations from the Evaluations of 2 Trauma-Informed Services. So I really hope that you'll come and join us again on the 28th, and look forward to seeing you then. But anyway, thanks everyone, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for having us today.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.